Okay, good evening. I guess the president's just wrapping up his press conference. You all have been watching it. I had watched about 15 minutes of it, and I needed to come down here and get prepared for this. Let me know in the chat room if he has mentioned anything about the supply chain and the economic impact globally or the United States regarding COVID-19. I've been watching your comments in the chat room here since I posted that question in there. I guess he's talking about a vaccine, and I had to leave before I could hear the rest of that. And a task force. I read something earlier that he was going to appoint a COVID-19 czar. Rise and Shine says, first and foremost, expand our surveillance network, is what the president also cited. So, yeah, well, $2.5 billion, and I guess the Democrats, some of them are even asking upwards of $8 billion for this. Well, we're going to talk about money tonight. We're going to talk about the economic impact, what I am calling the economic contagion, which is the title of the March edition of Entangled magazine. And by the way, if you know of anyone who has not subscribed to Entangled magazine, who has not joined us on Patreon, where, as you know, as patrons, you're automatically subscribed to my monthly magazine, and you get all of the archives dating back to the founding in June of 2017. And as well as all of the live streams. So I'm putting a pitch in, I'm putting a plug in for Patreon and all of the resources available there, including the almost daily news articles that I post, and also Entangled magazine. And I don't do that very often, but what I've decided to do is to keep these live streams private, because we like to have our privacy in the chat room primarily. And then in a day or 2 days later, following the broadcast, I make them public on YouTube. And so that's why I'm making the plug for Patreon and for the magazine. If people don't want to participate in Patreon, they can always subscribe just to Entangled magazine itself. And that way they are able to access the things that we talk about here and we examine. And the purpose of the magazine is go into the finer details, into the real weeds, if you will, of the topics that we covered throughout the month on these live streams. Tonight, we are going to talk about the economics of COVID-19, something that really is not broadly discussed and disseminated out into the mainstream media, at least as far as I can tell. A lot of you, as patrons, send emails to me with news items, news articles, tweets, and that type of thing that keeps me pretty well abreast of what the mainstream media is talking about, as well as the alternative media. So this is really a great platform for back and forth communications. Even though I'm not having you speak with me directly, you do through email. So that is very valuable, and I always encourage you not to hold back on your emails thinking that perhaps I've already seen something. It never hurts to do that. And I'm just checking the chat room here. Kathleen is monitoring the chat room. I don't know if she's going to log in tonight, but I know she's watching the chat room. And so we will get right into this without too much ado. I just kind of wanted to set the stage that whether COVID-19, the coronavirus, turns out to be a true global pandemic, whether it becomes a pandemic within the United States itself, whether it is determined that it was man-made and it originated in China, and how it originated, how it was let loose upon the world population. The fact that the media is relentless in its coverage of COVID-19. It gins up fear in people around the world. As the president said just before I had to leave the live broadcast of his press conference, he was indicating that he had received from one of the health officials the numbers on flu deaths within the United States, ranging, I think it was between 30 and 60,000 people. I didn't write it down, but somewhere in that range. And this is very true. The common flu and the variety of strains of flu every year cause many more deaths than we are seeing with COVID-19. And that's kind of setting aside the numbers coming out of China because they're not something we can rely on. But there's about 82,000 worldwide that we know of in terms of cases, not necessarily deaths. So those are just kind of the raw numbers. But the overall of this, when we look at this, as we like to say, from patch air, from 40,000 feet, and look at the big picture of this, look at the game board below us, the chessboard, the real issue is the psychological. The psychological impact upon the world's population that results in the shutting down of businesses, manufacturing, production, that then in turn lets the supply chain, much like if you were draining the water lines in your home to make repairs to the pipes, and you let the water drain out of the pipes, out of the supply lines, there's nothing left in those pipes except air. And this is really the effect of the COVID-19, is because of fear, that supply chain is being drained. And this will have an impact at some point, not only in the United States, but in other countries, because not everything comes out of China. It does represent the nexus of the global supply chain system, but not everything comes out of China, but certainly upwards of 30 to 40% of what is produced in the world that is then distributed through the supply chains does originate from China. So it does have a major impact on the supply chain and on the financial numbers. There are many other products that, of course, are imported into the United States and other countries that are exported, like Germany is predominantly an exporting nation, that also are cutting back on production, shutting down, again, because of fear of the spread of what is considered to be a highly contagious virus. So what I'm offering to you is we focused enough on COVID-19 in terms of looking at it as a virus, and we did that in the last live stream. I didn't spend a lot of time talking about the effects of 5G on this virus, and I will address that tomorrow in Thursday's live stream, which Thursdays are more of our technical day. And so tomorrow I will get into speaking about the actual millimeter wave effect on the cell membrane, which we introduced on Sunday. I went into discussing the effect of the 5G on that, but how does it really happen? How does, from an electromagnetic frequency basis, how does this really happen in terms of drawing a correlation between this certainly is a man-made virus and the broadcast of 5G millimeter wave electromagnetic frequencies? So we'll do that tomorrow, but tonight is economics, the economic contagion. And I'll be providing details tonight, not to an extreme degree, but introduce some of the details that are more thoroughly presented in the March 1st edition of Entangled magazine. So for those of you that really want to get deeper without being, ridiculous about it, but getting into talking about economics beyond the introductory level of tonight, I think you will appreciate it because it will give you a solid foundation as to the trending of the U.S. and the global economy and how fast things are progressing and what are those components that are progressing, the cause and effect, and the timeline, and trying to extrapolate into a near-term, mid-term, and long-term economic forecast, economic picture of what we can expect. So, speaking of that, let us go to the scripture for this evening, which is Ezekiel 7, verse 19. And this is under the desolation of Israel. And I'll begin with verse 18. They will put on sackcloth, and terror will overwhelm them. Shame will cover all their faces, and all their heads will be shaved. They will throw their silver into the streets, and their gold will seem unclean. Their silver and gold cannot save them in the day of the wrath of the Lord. They cannot satisfy their appetites or fill their stomachs with wealth, for it became the stumbling block that brought their iniquity. Absolutely relevant to today. If you want economic advice from me, I'm just going to speak as a layperson. I am not licensed to provide economic advice. I have to give that disclaimer, but the advice of one man is what I offer to you tonight. And it's pretty simple, really. It's very common sense, very logical. Again, it's not fear-based. It's just, what is a practical step from an economic standpoint? I wouldn't buy silver and gold, precious metals. I wouldn't buy stocks and I wouldn't buy bonds. I wouldn't buy commodities in general. Except to say, as a commodity, I would say food. Food, water, and medicines. Pretty basic. Okay, the things you buy every day at the grocery store. And I was having a discussion with Kathleen today, about basic preparedness. And we touched on the topic of long-term food storage, things that are able to stay on the shelf for 15, 20, 25 years, whatever. Things that a lot of people push. Well, I would offer to you this, that we made one examination of a provider. I won't mention the name, but they were indicating on their website a 4-week backlog of orders. Well, 4 weeks is a long time in the rapid advancement of all of these economic factors that I'm going to lay out to you tonight. My advice is, don't lock up your money for 4 weeks, hoping that you will receive those foods. I think the more practical thing is make a list of the everyday items that you would purchase anyway, and buy more of those locally, and have a reasonable amount of those foods and materials. Again, food, water, medicine, you can break that down further. But the idea here is, don't panic, but be prudent, and to the best of your ability, prepare in those areas. Go to your local, big box store, your discount store, where you can save some money and you can buy, in quantity. Go during the week when other people are working. Take a day off from work. Go when the stores aren't busy. Do it now, not later. Procter & Gamble put out some numbers indicating that their products very soon will be experiencing severe shortages because most of what they put into the supply line, the supply chain, originates in China. And most of our pharmaceuticals, including things like aspirin, originate from China. So things like toothpaste and soap and laundry detergent, your toilet paper typically is locally sourced, but medications that you need, that you require now, and that you could anticipate. And things like antiseptics, hydrogen peroxide, household bleach, denatured alcohol, rubbing alcohol, things that you would use to clean wounds, abrasions, minor lacerations, things like that. Have a reasonable first aid kit put together. And I'm not trying to paint a picture of, hey, you need to have enough food for a year, because most of us can't even begin to afford that, okay? And there isn't time to acquire that anymore because of the dwindling supply chain. So I would just offer to you what you think you can afford reasonably and what you can put together now from local suppliers that you can go down the street and purchase. Don't buy things online because you don't know when they're going to arrive. Buy it locally and put it away. If that's a week's supply, if that's 6 months supply, if it is a year's supply, it's according to what your means and capabilities are. I don't think it's necessary to buy more than 6 months. I think that's reasonable. Okay, if you can afford that. I know that many people in this group have been preparing for a year, 2 years, 3 years, maybe even more, slowly putting things away. And that's a great way to have done that, but there isn't that opportunity now. Again, I'm not trying to create panic. I'm just saying you're going to, I think, agree with me after I present some of these introductory levels about how the economy of the world, and in particular the United States, operates, which will bolster this idea that the supply chain is dwindling. Some analysts are saying that there's enough in the supply chain right now, when we talk about China specifically, those items originating from China, there are enough items for 30 days. Some say 60, some say 90. I think the more that the media continues to beat this drum about COVID-19, the more fear psychologically is going to take effect. And I don't think the supply chain is going to survive more than 30 days. I think it is within 30 days pretty much going to be exhausted. So let's define a supply chain very simply. Imagine the scenario. A product is manufactured in China. Let's say it's aspirin. Let's make it tangible. So a bottle of aspirin is produced in China, and it is put on a truck. It is taken to a shipping port inside a shipping container. That container is loaded on a seagoing vessel, a cargo ship, a container ship. And of course it crosses the Pacific, and in some cases it will go, to the eastern seaboard of the United States. Once it reaches the United States at a seaport, the container is unloaded, placed on a truck or immediately on a rail car. Then it travels across the country to different locations. Those shipping containers will arrive primarily at distribution centers. Sometimes they will actually arrive in warehouses, but warehouses really by design are minimal in this country. Most locations, receiving locations, are distribution centers. From there, they're almost immediately distributed out to the retail locations. And that's done by local trucking. So that's the supply chain, to get that bottle of aspirin from China into your local retailer. In that process of trucks, seagoing vessels, trucks and rail in the country, that's the supply within the supply chain. That's the water that's in the pipes. Okay? It takes a certain amount of time to cross the ocean, and then a certain amount of time to transport across the country, especially if it's going clear across the country to the eastern seaboard by rail primarily in that situation. So that's the lag time. It is the shipping time that is the lag time that comprises the amount of supply within that pipeline. And this is where you get the figures of, well, it's 30, 60, 90 days. I say that it is within the window of 30 days that all that shipping of product will have been completed, with nothing coming to replenish the supply. Now, as I presented to you on Sunday, in China, the shipping ports are already clogged. There are ships that are fully loaded with containers that are going out, but some are being restricted to stay in port. But the bigger issue is the incoming vessels off the ocean have no place to unload their containers because the ports are jammed. There are no humans working in the ports for the most part to unload ships or to load ships. And ships that are coming into those ports have been diverted to other ports outside of China. And so that has ground to a halt in terms of continuing to feed the supply chain. And that development occurred last week. So if you will, that's where the tap was turned off in the pipeline a week ago. And then whatever was in the pipeline will eventually drain out as they reach distribution centers and retailers, and those things are purchased in the retail centers. And that's why the shelves will begin to look bare. So, depending on the product, on the commodity, and where you're located, it may be that you're going to start seeing, shelves that are beginning to dwindle in their supplies a week from now, probably not more than 2 weeks from now. So I would recommend tomorrow, if you're capable, if you're able to go out with your list and do your shopping. Okay? Alrighty. I'd like to start with an article, and most of what I'm going to do tonight is to introduce economic terms to you and define those, but I will apply them. Okay? We're going to talk about things like the yield curve, liquidity trap. Okay? We'll talk about the Bretton Woods agreement regarding gold. And just opening my list here, of course. We will talk about quantitative easing, something that you've heard a lot about but may not necessarily understand, and so that's my job, is to bring that explanation, that understanding. So let us start with an article from Wired magazine from the 25th of this month, so yesterday. COVID-19 will mark the end of affluence politics. The possibility of a global pandemic will reveal our inability to make and distribute the things people need just in time for a presidential election. Now, I'll be adding things in as I typically do as I read through this, but just in time. Let's look at that for a moment, because in the supply chain system that I just described to you, the world pretty much in its entirety operates on the basic premise, the system, the supply chain system of just-in-time inventory, or as it used to be called, just-in-time delivery. But just-in-time inventory means that in the example of our bottle of aspirin, let's say you go into your local pharmacy or big box store and you buy a bottle of aspirin and it's scanned at the register. We've spoken an awful lot about supply chains, big data, edge computing. We talked about edge computing on Sunday's live stream. We've talked about artificial intelligence. We've talked about the blockchain systems. So this all begins to pull together. It all begins to coalesce. Everything that we've done that's been foundational in our discussions over the last few years comes into play today as we examine the supply chain. Because when that bottle of aspirin is scanned, virtually immediately, that data regarding the purchase of that bottle of aspirin is transmitted to the manufacturer of that aspirin in China. Real time. So they're already producing its replacement as you're walking out the door of your local store. And this is how we end up with figures like 30 days supply in the supply chain, because it may take 30 days for that newly manufactured bottle of aspirin to hit the shelf that you just picked up and purchased that bottle of aspirin from. Okay? That's how quickly things are moving in the world. This is just-in-time inventory. The average inventory that is held by a retailer in the United States is about 2 weeks. They have about a 2-week supply. That's the turnover of products on the shelf and what limited warehouse capability they have in the back of the store, which is really nothing more than their receiving area. Because what comes in by truck that night virtually is taken from receiving overnight and restocked onto the shelves. Okay? So it may be more practical to say that in the distribution centers, there's about 2 weeks of supply rather than saying it's in the stores. But that's the basic idea of just-in-time inventory. Okay? Now that sounds great from the standpoint of reducing the amount of warehouse capability in the United States that has to be maintained and paid for by a retailer, by a distributor. Certainly at a retailer, when it comes time for inventory and inventory taxes that must be paid on that inventory, the more that they can maintain a control over that and not have a lot of excess inventory on hand physically in the store, that's a cost control regarding or inventory tax. So there are a lot of reasons for that system, but it is to make things as efficient as possible. The cost controls. Because the bulk of the cost in the system is in the transportation. It's in the supply chain itself. It's not so much in the manufacturing and the packaging. It's in the distribution. It is in the transportation of it that most of the cost remains in the system today. The issue now is that this is a very fragile system. Any hiccup, any interruption, any interference, any viral outbreak can interfere with this supply chain. And this is what I was hoping the president would address tonight, but of course he did not. And what my job is tonight is to present to you what the president has not been talking about. And that's the economy, the economic impact due to the psychological impact, the fear of COVID-19. Whether it turns out to be a true global pandemic or even a pandemic within the United States is almost academic. Now that's not to minimize the pain, the suffering, and the outright deaths that are going on now and that it appears will continue to increase. But it is important for us to understand that impacting our lives to a greater extent will be the economic impact, not so much the health impact. Okay? We could call this economic contagion an economic pandemic, because truly that's what this is. Now, I could get all conspiratorial and talk about different scenarios, but I'm not going to do that tonight. That isn't necessary. What's necessary is to understand how the economies of the world operate, because this is what's in it for you and I. We always do this. What's in it for me? What does this mean to me? And somebody I've not mentioned in quite some time, what does this mean to Joe Bag of Donuts? Remember Joe Bag of Donuts? The average guy walking down the street who doesn't have a clue. Okay? The idea here, what's in it for you and me, is the economics, which means what I've just said. Go out and purchase what you need. Those economics. So it may seem rather dry for me to speak about the components of the economy that I'm going to share with you tonight. Things like quantitative easing and the inverse yield curve of the bond market and the Fed and the Treasury and T-bills, and getting into kind of the weeds in this a little bit. Again, just to introduce it to you. But it's important because at some point, the terminology, the things that I'm presenting to you tonight, you're going to be hearing more and more in the mainstream media as the economic supply chain impact begins to really make the news. Here's economically, from accounting, you hear this all the time. This is where it comes from, is from accounting. The bottom line is this. The blame for the global economic crash that I've been talking about for quite some time, leading to a global debt reset, leading to Libra, leading to the Antichrist. That's the punchline. The blame for the economic crash worldwide, which is inevitable now, will be COVID-19. That's not where the blame should be assigned. The blame should be assigned to those that have constructed this global economic system that we are imprisoned in. The blame isn't to the individuals. The blame is to those in a position of power that have constructed this system. And it's not a new phenomenon. This system has been around really since, as we have shared with you, since the time of the Knights Templars, when the banking system really began. And then we see the advent of the Rothschild banking system and so forth and so on. And you guys are all familiar with that discussion. But it's the banking system that we are imprisoned in that's to blame. So it's worth taking it apart and looking at how it functions. But understand, the bottom line is that those that created and are perpetuating this system will not be blamed. Therefore, they will not be held accountable. And that's not just the bankers and the financiers, but it are the sovereign governments, the elected and non-elected leaders of countries around the world that are also to be held accountable for this. But in order to deflect that, they have to have something other than themselves to blame. So this takes us 360 degrees around. We just did the 180, which is to say, wait a second, they're trying to blame COVID, when in fact it's themselves that are blaming COVID that are to blame. That's the 180. But to bring us all the way back to the point of origin, the 360 on this whole process, is that COVID-19, being a human construct, was purposely released at a specific time. Again, not trying to sound conspiratorial, but I think it's pretty obvious when you look at the track record of the economy just over the last year. And I'm talking about the global economy, not just the United States. That long before, in September of last year, when the first case of COVID-19 was identified, the global economy, including the United States economy, and that sounds strange, given the stock market's been performing so well, but behind the stock market, beyond just looking at the stock market as a barometer, as a bellwether of the overall economy within the United States, the U.S. economy has been on a downward trend, along with the rest of the world. But you won't hear that in the mainstream media. So this downward trend was reaching a tipping point. It's by design. This was not out of control. This was not a surprise. This is by design. Again, taking back just a few moments ago, I said it's by design because they need a global economic crash leading to a debt reset, because none of the world debts can be repaid. They're too enormous. And that's by design. Because the design is to bring in a single global currency, which is Libra. And I presented that extensively in the January issue of Entangled magazine, devoted entirely to that. It's called Creative Destruction, the January issue. So I set the stage for you in January to understand what is going to be further discussed in the March edition. Because the debts have been rung up by design in order to line the pockets of the 1%ers of the world. That's the short term. The long-term goal is to have a one world economic system, of course Libra being the currency, but a one world global system by which it is required that you take the mark of the beast to participate in that global system, that global economy, which is ultimately controlled by none other than the Antichrist himself. So from our biblical perspective, we know where this is going, and we know that this is all by design, and we don't have to be conspiratorial. We just have to be scriptural. Those that have turned away from God and turned away from the Word are clueless, like Joe Bag of Donuts. And all they know is fear, because that's what the world pushes on them. But we don't have to be fearful in all of this. We can remain clear-headed, critical thinkers, use our individual intellect to examine this in a sober fashion, prepare for it in the near term, but we know that ultimately this is all part of God's plan. It's all under His control, and as God's children, He will do what He wants with us, of course. But we've turned our lives over to Him, so we shouldn't be concerned about this. But we do need to be good Bereans. We need to examine things for ourselves. We need to then be equipped with knowledge in which we can be good witnesses. So as in all of these live streams, we're presenting information to you that equips you so that you can witness with this information. That bottom line is for the salvation of souls. Okay? So let's look at a couple of things here. I'm going to go back to this article that I just started to introduce to you. Again, from Wired magazine. On Tuesday, President Donald Trump dismissed concerns about COVID-19. As he put it, the virus is, quote, under control in the U.S., and the whole situation will start working out. But according to Politico, Trump is privately voicing worries that the impact of the virus will undermine his chances of re-election. his panicked actions of late, including preventing an American from being treated in Alabama at the request of a fearful Senator Richard Shelby, confirmed that this virus is a political event of the first magnitude. While few in Washington have internalized it, the coronavirus is the biggest story in the world and is soon going to smash into our electoral politics in unpredictable ways. Well, again, I'm going to insert parenthetically quite a bit here. It is predictable. All we have to do is understand how the economies operate, even just to an introductory level, and it is predictable from reading the Word, from Scripture, from the Bible. Okay, as John Stokes notes, we will, in all likelihood, be locking down travel in some areas of the U.S. for several weeks, as they did in China. People may be advised against gathering in large groups. It's not clear what any of this will mean for campaigning or primary voting, whether most of us will vote by mail or have our votes delayed. Moreover, the coronavirus is going to introduce economic conditions with which few people in modern America are familiar. The prospect of shortages. After 25 years of offshoring and consolidation, we now rely on overseas production for just about everything. Now, in the wake of the coronavirus, China has shut down much of its production. South Korea and Italy will shut down as well. Once the final imports from these countries have worked their way through the supply chains and hit our shores, it could be a while before we get more. This coronavirus will reveal, in other words, a crisis of production, and one that's coming just in time for a presidential election. Okay, they give some background economically to other, recessions, depression, failures in the system. Let's move on. Okay. I'll get past the partisan part of this article. The era's political desperation is alien to us for a few reasons. First off, we haven't faced shortages of such magnitude for a very long time. More importantly, we have for decades lived under a political framework known as affluence, a term popularized by economist John Kenneth Galbraith in the 1950s. As an affluent society, America automatically produces a surfeit of jobs and wealth, and the problem is solely one of distributing the bounty. Under the siren song of affluence, we began offshoring critical production capacity in the 1960s for geopolitical reasons. In 1971, economist Nicholas Kaldor noted that American financial policies were turning a nation of creative producers into a community of rentiers, increasingly living on others, seeking gratification and ever more useless consumption, with all the debilitating effects of the bread and circuses of imperial Rome. Still, Bill Clinton and George Bush accelerated this trend throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Affluence politics is not the politics of being wealthy, though, but rather the politics of paying attention to what creates wealth in the first place. That is to say, it's the politics of ignoring our ability to make and distribute the things we need. With the banking collapse of 2008, the election of Trump in 2016, and his mourning of empty factories, and now with Bernie Sanders dominating the early primaries, that era may at last be passing. A pandemic disease outbreak would only hasten this progression and force us back into the politics of production. With potential shortages of goods and restrictions on people's movement, both parties are heading into unknown territory. It is likely Democrats will use this opportunity to further their case for Medicare for all. Pandemic surveillance and medical bureaucracies are focused on billing do not mix well. Stories about astronomical out-of-pocket costs for COVID-19 testing are already circulating. Republicans are likely to take a more xenophobic approach emphasizing restrictions on foreigners and infected Americans. When it comes to managing shortages, however, both parties are split, just as they were in 1932, between their Wall Street factions that assume affluence and the less mature populist factions that seek assertive public power. The Democratic Party primaries certainly echo those of the Great Depression, with candidates from Bernie Sanders to Amy Klobuchar trying to wrap themselves in FDR's mantle. Regardless, the end of affluence politics means focusing on whether medicine is on the shelves, not bitter disputes over bloated and wasteful hospital and insurance billing departments. It means caring about bureaucratic competence in government and accuracy in media, not because these are nice things to have, but because they are necessary to avoid immense, widespread suffering. It means understanding that pharmaceutical mergers that benefit shareholders while laying off scientists are destructive, not just because they are unfair, but because they make us less resilient to disease. Finally, it means recognizing that wealth, real wealth, is not defined by accounting games on Wall Street, but the ability to meet the needs of our own people. Okay, I'm going to jump past a few things here. There's a final quote here of Federal Reserve President Tom Barkin. Central banks can't come up with vaccines. Okay? So I hope that provides an overview of the situation of what's going on here. I'd like to put up something to start with here that you may or may not have encountered before. But this is the linchpin. This is the tipping point. This is the barometer. This is the indicator around which I'm going to build some other economic terms and build the picture of how the economies function. The yield curve and its inversion, which we have not seen that often in this country, has to do with debt. This has to do with the financing of debt. This has to do with treasury bills, treasury bonds, and those bonds represent the U.S. economic, the U.S. government debt. This is government spending financed by the Treasury and controlled by the Federal Reserve, that the deficit spending that the United States has been in essentially since 1971, and we will get into talking about the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1971, when we went off the gold standard, courtesy of President Nixon as the figurehead for the bankers taking us off the gold standard, the military-industrial complex taking us off the gold standard, because what it resulted in is the U.S. dollar no longer being tied to gold as a monetary standard representing the U.S. dollar. It allowed the U.S. dollar to then become a fiat currency, just like all other currencies in the world that are not tied to gold or silver or some other accepted commodity. In other words, there's no collateral behind the U.S. dollar, as well as other currencies. So they're called fiat currencies. Well, since then, the U.S. government has been deficit spending. It's been a free-for-all. They've been racking up debt with really no intent ever of balancing the budget and reversing the deficit spending. So how do you finance deficit spending? You issue bonds. Okay? And bonds represent the debt. The bonds are sold into the investment marketplace. Institutional buyers, business buyers, wealthy buyers, and not so wealthy individuals will buy up bonds. Again, those bonds represent U.S. governmental spending. It allows the government to have money. They get the money from those purchasers of the bonds, and those dollars flow into the U.S. Treasury. And then the U.S. has something to pay its bills with, taking it out of the U.S. Treasury. Now, I know most of you already know this. I'm trying to just make this an introductory level. Some may not have heard all of the mechanisms, and we're going to get a little deeper into it. But that's an overview. And so when we talk about bonds being sold into the marketplace, what do investors, what do purchasers of bonds receive? Why would they give the government their money? Well, obviously, they get a return on their investment in the form of interest. So bonds have an interest rate tied to them. And there are different types of bonds depending on their time frame to maturity. So you can see here on the graphic, you have a 2-year bond and you have a 10-year bond. That means, and there are others that are intermediate to that, you can go out to a 30-year bond, but we're just using the 2-year and the 10-year, which are considered short-term bonds, that they mature fairly quickly, meaning that when the bond matures, that person's original investment, let's say I bought a bond for $100 and it was a 2-year maturity bond, 2-year bond. At the end of 2 years, they get their $100 back. During that 2 years, they're receiving interest payments on that $100. Now that's a fixed interest rate for 2 years. And that's a relatively low interest rate because it's such a short period of time. But if you go out to a 30-year, in other words, you have to wait 30 years to get your original money back, you're going to receive a higher interest payment on that 30-year bond. Okay? So that's called the yield, that interest. Typically, you would see a short-term bond, like a 2-year bond or a 10-year bond, have a low interest rate. So what you're looking at here should be flipped horizontally, or I should say flipped vertically on a horizontal axis, should be flipped upside down. What you should see on the left would be lower than what you see on the right. The interest rate, the yield, on the right side of this graph should be much higher, an upward climbing graph. While at the left side of the graph, at the beginning point, with the short-term bonds, you should see a much lower interest rate. Now, what you're seeing on the screen doesn't happen very often, and this is the present situation with the bond market. In other words, this is backwards, or if you will, this is upside down. Who controls these rates? Not the Treasury, but the Federal Reserve, the bankers. Okay? This is the Federal Reserve on the world stage is known as a central bank, and every country has a central bank, including China. And they finance, because every country is a deficit spending, a debtor nation, they all have bonds or some other instrument that they sell into the world market to finance their government's deficit spending. Okay, that keeps all of these governments operating. Why would the Fed, the central bank of the United States, allow the situation you're seeing on the screen? Why would they be paying more interest for short-term bonds than they are paying for long-term bonds, 30-year, 15 and 30-year bonds? Because they're desperate. They're desperate for something. They're desperate for cash. In the markets, that's called liquidity. That's like if you were to take an asset that you hold and you sell it, you're liquidating that asset for cash. Pretty simple. Well, the Fed does the same thing. They take the Treasury bills, the Treasury notes, the T-bills, the bonds, it's all the same thing. And the Fed says to the marketplace, if you buy a 2-year or a 10-year bond today, we will actually provide you more incentive to do that in the form of higher interest rates. Why wouldn't they do that with the 30-year? Because they're desperate. They're desperate for cash. They're desperate for liquidity. Some people would think that this is an out-of-control situation. But it's not out of control. It's by design. Many people say, and write to me, it's all rigged. You know, we talk about presidential elections. It's all rigged. Well, so's the market. People say, you know, the stock market's rigged. Of course it is. The bond market's rigged. Government deficit spending is rigged. Well, what does rigged mean? It's by design. It's designed to fail at some point. So the act of desperation is a present time, near term situation that the average observer would say, well, that's a panic move on the part of the Fed. And many economic analysts would use the same language of panic without bothering to describe, or perhaps because of their own lack of understanding, as you and I have, of the bigger picture and the longer term picture, that it's all designed to crash. Those economists, those analysts, don't want to go there. They don't want to think in that way. Because their paradigm is, we have to keep the markets going. We have to keep kicking the can of debt further and further down the road. Well, I can remember when I was very young, and my dad was talking about, he was a Republican, very conservative, very fiscally conservative. He was saying about the government and the bankers in the 60s. He was telling me, they keep kicking this down the road. And then I remember very clearly, I was a junior in high school in 1971, and we went off the gold standard. My dad was livid, because he knew that this was only going to create more debt and that they would continue to kick the can of debt down the road. Well, I'm here to tell you today that can cannot be kicked any further down the road. And that analogy has been used by economists for years, kicking it down the road. Well, it can't be done anymore. The day of reckoning has arrived for the global economy, and again, it's by design. They want it to crash so that their Luciferian Antichrist spirit can come into the position that prophecy has told us he is destined to occupy. Because at the end of the day, we know that the 1%ers, if we want to use that as a label, are Luciferian. And they make no bones about it. And you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to say that and understand that that's the case of the world. That's the state of the world. So again, this is by design. So we look at this yield curve and say, okay, they're getting people to put their money down for a higher interest rate than they would receive on a longer term debt, 30-year bond. What the Fed is doing is providing liquidity, immediate injection of cash into the U.S. Treasury. Because the economy of the United States, irrespective of the U.S. stock market, which is really all that the president ever talks about in terms of the economy, He keeps pointing the finger at the stock market as the single indicator of how the economy is operating. Well, I'm here to tell you that the manufacturing sector and the service sector have been plummeting. Plummeting. Those are two major indicators of the state of the U.S. economy. The stock market is like putting a new coat of paint on a building that is full of dry rot and termites, and the foundation crumbled a long time ago. But the president only says, look at how beautiful that paint job is. Okay? I'm the building inspector, and I'm examining the foundation, the wiring, the plumbing, the woodwork, the brickwork, the stonework, the roof. And I'm here to tell you, don't buy it. Despite the fact that the seller just put a brand new coat of paint on and may even have put a new roof on the house. Looks great on the outside. But I'm the building inspector. I'm the housing inspector that's telling you, as the consumer, the buyer of the debt, it's all rotten from the core. The Fed knows that. The president knows that. The Treasury knows that. But they have to prop it up as long as they can. And the president, even in the article I just read to you from yesterday, is more concerned about getting reelected. So he's slapping more paint on the house as quick as he can. And he's got a guy out there with a thing on the back of his painting jacket that says Czar. And he's slapping paint on the house for the president so he can get reelected. So they sell bonds with a higher interest rate for short-term bonds than they should be, than they really ever do. This is why I'm starting with the yield curve inversion, because this is the true barometer of what's going on behind the scenes. I'm showing you the foundation of the house, and the foundation is upside down. Imagine trying to buy a house with the foundation where the roof should be. Well, that just means that the roof and the whole building collapsed if the highest thing that you can see is the foundation. Okay? Let's move along. I've got something else to show you. Oftentimes since 2008 and the so-called housing bubble that burst, the mortgage crisis, you've heard several times, and I'm going to read from my notes here, quantitative easing on the part of the Fed, the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States. The first quantitative easing took place in 2009. The second one during the period of 2010 and 11. The third one was 2012 through 13 and part of 14. Part of 14. And now we are seeing a new form. The Fed won't call it quantitative easing. They don't want to call it that. And most of the analysts that I've been reading and listening to, they too are puzzled because there's been no label assigned to the actions of the Fed. It's a form of quantitative easing, and that began in 2017 through 18 through 19. And now we go to the inverted bond yield that I just showed you in 2020. You see, all of this since 2008 has been a overall downward curve of the entire U.S. economy. So how is it that the U.S. stock market has been reaching higher and higher record levels? How does that happen? How does that happen? If the underlying economic indicators are all downward. Smoke and mirrors. It's the magician, right? Left hand, right hand. Because since the housing bubble, quantitative easing has been used to prop up the economy, to push liquidity, to push cash into the marketplace. So the graphic I have displayed up here gives you an idea, and then I'm going to read what quantitative easing is as a definition, but we'll start with getting a picture of what it looks like. First step is the central bank, that's the Fed, creates money. That money is used to buy bonds from the financial institutions. Okay? Those bonds, where there's a 3% interest rate, or in the third step, there's an interest rate that's paid. This reduces the interest rate. So when the central bank prints money, the Treasury, but through the Fed, the direction of the Fed, when money is pushed into the market, it short-term pushes down interest rates in the economy, much like if you were to obtain a credit card or a mortgage for a home or to finance a business, starting a business, buying capital equipment, and so forth. The interest rates on those loans are driven down. The reason that they do that is to stimulate the economy. So step number 4 is this leads to businesses and people borrowing more because the interest rates are lower. Step 5, so those people spend more and create jobs. The end result, step 6, is that there's a boost to the economy. You can see how this is all very artificially contrived because it's printing fiat money, which is not tied to a gold standard. Printing money, and that action of printing money really is printing debt. It's creating more instruments of debt. The more that you print money out of thin air, the more debt that's created. And they create bonds, which are sold into the marketplace. Now, the reducing of interest, let's look at that, because here's the mechanism. First of all, the bonds are sold, and that goes back into the U.S. Treasury, into the government, to finance the operation of the U.S. government. We said that earlier. But then also, when the Fed is printing money, that money is made available to banks at a reduced interest rate. Not just the interest rate on consumer loans and business loans, but private banks, let's say Bank of America, goes to the Federal Reserve and needs to purchase money that they can then loan out. Well, the Federal Reserve charges an interest rate. There's a cost to that money. So when that cost, when that interest rate charged by the Fed to the private banks is lower, the private banks are enticed, they're induced to buy that money. That's the prime rate. So the prime lending rate is when that private bank, Bank of America, makes that money available to an individual who wants to buy a house. So the prime lending rate has another 0.5 percentage point, it's called. A point is 1%. 0.5 point, a point, 1.5 points, 2 points is added above the prime in order to establish the retail interest rate for that mortgage loan. Now, right now, the average mortgage for a 30-year mortgage is around 3%. Now, I'm going to get a little bit ahead of myself, but the Fed already is being pressured by the marketplace and by the president, quite pointedly, because he wants to get reelected. The pressure is on the Fed, as the analysts will describe it. It's really not outside pressure. It's the Fed doing this internally anyway. But you hear it in the media, there's pressure on the Fed to cut interest rates in order to continue to stimulate the economy. What that means is cutting the interest rate to the private banks like Bank of America so that Bank of America will purchase more money from the Fed, turn around and lend that money for the purchase of a home. Now this week, the housing market has been dramatically on an upward curve. Sales of new homes and existing homes is climbing steadily all week. Last week, I should say, and into this week. The housing market is stimulated. That's because the money is cheap. Again, many of you already know this, but bear with me. I'm moving deeper into the technicals on this. So quantitative easing provides stimulus for banks to loan money for more loans to go out, buying of homes, stimulating business activity. Okay? And that artificially boosts the economy. But boosting the economy comes at the price of printing money out of thin air, which is printing debt. So let's look at how the stock market got propped up by this. Ordinarily, a business valuation is tied to a couple of things. The existing assets of a business, its products or services or mixture that it provides, the market outlook quarterly and out to 5 years for that business in terms of the lifespan of its product or viability of its service. And you'll recall last week we talked about the theft of intellectual property on the part of the Chinese and the economic impact that has on the lifespan of a business. Okay, that paid for the R&D and the time that it took to bring a product to market. Well, without rehashing that live stream, let's focus on an existing product, and let's say it has a 5-year lifespan that's projected, and each quarter the business will report on its sales and on its earnings, and it will have earnings projections, especially if they're publicly traded and they're owned by shareholders. Okay, they have to provide their quarterly reports. Now, that business valuation, based on what I just briefly outlined to you, typically that valuation, when there is integrity in the system, will provide an accurate economic picture of that business and its value, what it's worth to potential investors, like people that want to purchase that company's publicly traded public stock. Okay? Well, what's happened is that companies have been inflating the numbers, if you will, based upon what they project the overall economy is going to do. They are projecting their growth and their valuation as a result of that projection of growth that is tied to the projection of the overall economy. And what ends up happening is businesses have an inflated valuation. Well, investors who may not be doing the proper examination and vetting, doing their due diligence, as it's called in the world of investing, without doing proper due diligence, they emotionally make a decision to purchase a stock. Emotionally, because they're greedy, driven by inherent greed on the part of the investor. And this happens with institutional investors and hedge funds and brokerage houses. Because of greed, they say, wow, okay, I'll accept that business's projection to the future that has overinflated, artificially inflated their valuation, making them appear to be worth more than they really are. And so they're willing to pay a premium for that stock to get in on the ground floor, if you will, to get in early and ride the stock up in those artificial numbers of projecting into the future the performance of that company. And so because of greed, they jump in. They pay an inflated price in today's market. And because of quantitative easing that rears its ugly head on a periodic basis by way of the Fed, because there's this pumping of cash, and this is what the analysts call it, there's a literal pumping of liquidity into the markets. And it's this pumping action by way of the Fed that keeps pushing the economy artificially because of debt that's been created, fiat currency that's printed. It's the debt that actually causes that artificial valuation of a business, of the economy as a whole. And so it is through the acquisition of more debt that the stock market artificially goes up. This is why it's called a bubble. It's artificially inflated. We're not talking about inflation in terms of the price of goods and services and commodities, not that inflation. We're talking about the inflation of the economy as a whole because it's based on debt. And the more debt that is created, in other words, more printing of money, the more debt that's created, the more the appearance is given to the economy of doing very well. Hence, the President of the United States uses that bright, shiny, fresh coat of paint from the paint bucket that's labeled debt is painted on the building, and it all looks wonderful. And that's why he keeps pointing to it. Because the average Joe Bag of Donuts doesn't understand economics, and certainly is not going to look behind the veil, behind the curtain, to see what the Wizard of Oz is doing with the economy. And I'm not blaming Trump. Trump's just the spokesperson for the Federal Reserve, for the bankers, for the 1% that run the world. He's just the spokesperson. Okay? So it's not Trump, despite the fact that he's a billionaire. Okay? It's not Trump. So let me read the actual definition to you of quantitative easing. I always like to define things here, so I like to read from the source. Bear with me if this sounds a little dry. I know a lot of this has been dry, but I hope you're taking notes. Quantitative easing, QE, also known as large-scale asset purchases, is a monetary policy whereby a central bank buys predetermined amounts of government bonds or other financial assets in order to inject liquidity directly into the economy. An unconventional form of monetary policy, it is usually used when inflation is very low or negative, and standard expansionary monetary policy has become ineffective. A central bank implements quantitative easing by buying specified amounts of financial assets from commercial banks and other financial institutions, thus raising the prices of those financial assets and lowering their yield, while simultaneously increasing the money supply. This differs from the more usual policy of buying or selling short-term government bonds to keep interbank interest rates at a specified target value. Expansionary monetary policy to stimulate the economy typically involves the central bank buying short-term government bonds to lower short-term market interest rates. However, when short-term interest rates approach zero or reach zero, this method can no longer work, a situation known as a liquidity trap. So let me go to liquidity trap for you, and we will define that. A liquidity trap is a situation in which, after the rate of interest has fallen to a certain level, liquidity preference may be virtually absolute, in the sense that almost everyone prefers holding cash rather than holding a debt with yields so low a rate of interest. A liquidity trap is caused when people hoard cash because they expect an adverse event such as deflation, insufficient aggregate demand, or war. According to mainstream theory, among the characteristics of a liquidity trap are interest rates that are close to zero and changes in the monetary supply that fail to translate into changes in the price level. So let me take all of that apart for you just before I go on further with quantitative easing. What we're talking about here, let me get back on camera here. What we're talking about here, in simple terms, is that when the typical market purchasing of government debt does not work, when the bond market fails, when the interest rates paid on bonds is so low that the bonds are no longer attractive to buyers of bonds. They'd rather have their cash, because if you're only paying 0.5% or 1% on a bond, and you've got your money locked up in that bond, you can't touch that money for 2 years or 5 years or even further out, even to 30 years. People don't want to lock up their money. They'd rather hold on to it and look for other investments with a more immediate return, and that has, if need be, immediate liquidity. It means the ability to immediately sell an investment, something that they've purchased. There's no guarantee regarding bonds. Let's say you buy a 2-year bond and you're getting 1% for that. There's no guarantee you're going to find during that 2 years a buyer willing to buy that bond, take it off your hands for what you paid for it. Because if that bond, which was receiving 1%, faces competition because new bonds that come out after your purchase have a higher interest, a higher rate of return, no one's going to want to buy. Thus, you cannot liquidate and get your original investment back. No one will buy a bond with only a 1% rate of return. They'll buy the bond that has a 2% rate of return. You see, that's the risk in the bond market. It's not easily convertible to cash. There has to be a market for that bond. And if there isn't, you're stuck until the end of its maturity, which is 2 years in this case, and then the government will give you back your original investment. So for 2 years, you're stuck. So there's a real danger for the Fed to say they're going to drive down the interest rates on bonds, because people don't want to buy a low-yield bond. This is why we go back to the yield curve, where 2-year bonds are made very attractive because the government wants immediate cash, immediate pumping into the marketplace, increasing the supply of money, the money supply. And that puts another coat of paint on the stock market and causes the market to continue to move to record highs. So what you're looking at with this yield curve is that can of paint that I said is labeled as debt paint. It might as well be labeled with bond paint. Okay? So this is an immediate short-term pumping into the money supply to prop up the stock market. And President Trump and those that have him in power and want him reelected, they have to keep pumping the stock market until the election. I'm going to go back to quantitative easing, the definition, but I want to stop right here because we're talking about a time frame, and lots of people like to focus on what's going to happen tomorrow, what's going to happen in a week, what's going to happen between now and the election. Those in power right now would like to see Donald Trump reelected. I'm not slamming the president, okay? I'm just laying out the situation. In order to get him reelected, the economy needs to continue to go up. Despite what I said behind the scenes of the downward slope, if you really do your due diligence, you see that the curve of the economy is downward, and all economies around the world are downward precipitously, including China, before the COVID virus. But what everybody's focused on, and as I said, the president keeps touting, is the record highs of the U.S. market. And so on a global scale, investors rush to a place of safety with their monies. And the only real place that's called in investing a safe haven for cash is the U.S. stock market right now. It is the best performing return on investment, ROI, on the planet. So investors are also putting that coat of paint on the stock market because they are rushing from their declining economies into this safe haven of the U.S. stock market, which is artificially propped up by debt through the Fed. But in there, I showed you the indicator of the inverted yield curve of the bond market, which is your window into what is really going on. It's the real indicator as to the health. That's taking the thermometer and putting it under the tongue of the patient. The yield curve in the bond market tells it all. Okay? So the market continues to get pumped because November's coming. And the president wants to keep those market numbers going up because Joe Bag of Donuts only sees the market. And that's all the economic knowledge that Joe Bag of Donuts has, is the market. Well, the market's not the economy. Back in 2008, the mortgage crisis, the housing bubble, when it burst, the stock market was separated from the U.S. economy. Separated. The stock market was pumped up, as I've been describing the mechanisms, pumped up and pumped up and pumped up. So the overall, as you see the ups and downs in the market, the overall curve since 2008 has been upward for the U.S. stock market because it keeps getting pumped and pumped and pumped with dollars. The U.S. dollar is still the recognized reserve currency for the entire world. I don't care what Russia and China say. It doesn't matter. The majority of the world still invests and holds U.S. dollars. Now this week and beginning on Thursday of last week, but certainly on Monday, the U.S. dollar shot up as high as 3 times what it was 2 weeks ago. The U.S. dollar is climbing, but you know what? In a very rare move in the gold market, and also the silver market, but gold has been climbing in value while the U.S. dollar has also been climbing in value. And any of you that follow the gold markets and follow the foreign exchange markets, you know that normally those are diametrically opposed. When one goes up, the other goes down. So when the dollar goes up, gold goes down. When gold goes up, the dollar goes down in valuation. Because there's a flight to safety, flight to security. When dollars plummet in value on the foreign exchange, on the currency exchange, I should say, the flight to gold takes place, and that drives up the price of gold. When gold starts to drop, then people flee to the dollar and buy up on the currency market, buy US dollars, and that pushes the dollar up. Neither of those is taking place right now. This is an indicator to you of how screwed up the world economy is and why this is so precipitous for the president in his bid to get reelected in November. Because right now, both gold and the dollar are both going up. Why? Because investors around the world realize the only safe haven are both the dollar and both gold. And most economic advisors out there are pushing gold and silver. So silver's going up rapidly as well. So they're saying, look, if you really want to be safe, go to precious metals. Go to the metals market. Well, I'm telling you, go out and buy food. Go out and buy your necessities of life. Don't buy gold and don't buy silver. That's why I used that scripture. Okay? Let me put it up there again. Ezekiel 7, verse 19, where they are casting their silver and their gold into the streets. Because you cannot eat gold, you cannot eat metal. But you can eat food. And you can take care of your health, of yourself and your families, with the medicines and the commodities you need for living. So don't buy gold and silver. But this is where the investors are directing people. The advisors and investors are going into precious metals, but they're also going into the US dollar. Why are they going into the US dollar? Is because the market is performing so well, and because the Fed is pumping the market with more cash, more liquidity. And they're offering higher interest rates on short-term bonds. So investors are saying, I don't mind locking up some of my money in the bond market for a short period of time while I invest in gold and silver as well. And because of this overvaluation of businesses that are publicly traded, people are buying those stocks because the projection put out by the president is all is well. All is well. Don't panic. All is well. The market's going to keep outperforming the rest of the world. So buy those stocks. Let's look at Apple, because I think it's 30% of iPhones are manufactured in China. And the first quarter projections by Apple, before the COVID virus became this panic situation, they were projecting their growth figures. And it artificially inflated their valuation. And investors rushed to buy Apple stocks. 3 weeks after those reports, those projections were put out by Apple, they had to retract those projections, reforecast their projections, and their stock plummeted. I give you that as an example of what's going to happen with most every, well, I might as well say it, virtually every publicly traded company in the United States. And that is, again, by design. We are going to see the largest stock market crash in the history of the world. Will President Trump get reelected if there's a stock market crash? No. He'll be blamed for it. Of course. Does he want that on his watch? No. So what is the president, what's his modus operandi, as I often say? What is he going to do? And I'm using him again because he's the figurehead of all of these guys, the private bankers that make up the Federal Reserve. And not just the Federal Reserve, but all the central banks of the world that are all in collusion. And the most primary, and I'm not going to go down this tangent, but the primary central bank and where all of the central banks gather and get their marching orders from is the Bank of London, in the City of London. Okay? Look up the City of London and the Bank of London. I'm not talking about the Bank of England. I'm talking about the bank that is physically in the Bank of the City of London. Okay? That's the true central bank. Anyway, that's a tangent. Maybe I'll talk about that more tomorrow. Here's the real point here, is that the Fed has to keep pumping through quantitative easing, and they can call it whatever they want, but the effect is the same, pumping liquidity into the economy, which continues to prop up through debt, prop up the markets until the president can get reelected in November. That's their mechanism. But can they hold the economy together until November? Let's ask the bigger question from 40,000 feet on patch air. Do they want President Trump reelected? Do they want the economy to hold together and the markets to continue to hit record highs until November? I would say no, that they don't want President Trump reelected. He's irrelevant to their overall bigger picture plan. President Trump is irrelevant in comparison to putting the Antichrist in power. I don't think you've ever heard that spoken in public before. President Trump is irrelevant in comparison to putting the Antichrist in power. So they don't care if he gets reelected or not. It doesn't matter who's president. If it's Bernie Sanders or Michael Bloomberg, it doesn't make any difference. Therefore, what I'm saying is that I do not think the economy can be propped up until November. And it isn't because it's out of control of the one percenters. It's by design that it is going to crash. And this brings us 360 degrees all the way back to COVID-19. The one percenters, knowing that the economies of the world have been on a downward projection, downward slope by design, for their long-term plan to crash the economies and force a debt reset. They've been designed to travel downward, all the economies of every country. And therefore, in September of last year, they brought out COVID-19 because they needed a target that they could direct Joe Bag of Donuts to point the finger of blame to that target, to blame COVID-19 as a cover-up to their purposeful crashing of the global economy. So this is timed not to prop up the economies until November, but to crash the economies as quickly as possible. Now, this is very dire information. I recognize that. And I'm right here with you. I'm part of this economy. Do I want to see this happen? But no, the can of debt cannot be kicked down the road any further. And why the timing of September right on up to the present for COVID-19? Because the one percenters understood that, and let's make it simple, because of the internet, because of sharing of information, they were fearful. Even though they've suppressed it, they've covered it up, they've painted the building with fresh coats of paint, and they've tried to distract people through entertainment, etc., and distract with fear. People from examining, from being critical thinkers and examining the world's economy and the engine, how it operates, to keep people from doing their due diligence on the economies. They knew they could only do that for so long until there's this groundswell of people to begin to see what's really going on. They see economic numbers. They see manufacturing numbers. They see service sector numbers. Other people are all dazzled by tech sector numbers. Okay? But they realized, the one percenters, that they couldn't cover up the rotten foundation and the dry rot and the termites. And so they had to bring in COVID-19 to cover up their dastardly deeds, to remove the accountability from them, the pointing of the finger at government leaders, financiers, bankers, and point the finger of blame to what some are calling an act of God, COVID-19. Because it turns the Joe Bag of Donuts to looking over here and not looking over here at the economy. Just be fearful of this pandemic. Don't look at who's to blame for the economic crash. That by design, because COVID was brought in to produce fear, to stop manufacturing, to cut off the infusion of products into the supply chain. And by cutting off the supply chain, you're able to have literally more impact on humans than COVID-19 ever will. Because you have starvation, you have rioting, you have people killing each other. I know this is terrible to present to you, but I'm not being sensational here. I'm being factual. I'm being lucid. I'm being pragmatic. This is my duty as a watchman on the wall. More people will die due to the economic collapse, the collapse of the supply chain, than ever will die from COVID-19. And that's by design. Because again, it takes us around to that discussion of population reduction. Certainly COVID-19 will have some effect in that direction, but the economic crash will have an even bigger impact on reducing the population of the world. And again, it takes us back to Scripture. A third of the world. It's all part of God's plan. We don't know the mind of God. We don't understand these mechanisms that God is utilizing. We want to point the finger of blame at Satan and Lucifer, but he is the hammer of judgment. He is the executor of judgment on the part of God. And I don't even begin to suppose that I understand the mind of God and understand how this all operates. I can go to Scripture, certainly, but the point is, much of this is above and beyond our level of understanding. But it is happening. And it is prophetic. It is biblical. Okay. So quantitative easing. A central bank enacts quantitative easing by purchasing, regardless of interest rates, a predetermined quantity of bonds and other financial assets on financial markets from private financial institutions. This action increases the excess reserves that the bank holds. So this excess reserves takes me to my next discussion here. And again, we talked about the liquidity trap, where people would rather hold their cash rather than owning a debt instrument like a bond. Okay? So reserves. Private banks have to have a certain amount of cash on hand, known as a cash reserve. Now, through the process of fractional lending means that they can lend out more money than they have on hand. So above and beyond their cash reserves, there are multiples of factoring that they can utilize. And the government controls the Security and Exchange Commission and the Federal Reserve. They dictate to private banks this factoring. They will say you can lend X percentage beyond. So if, let's say you have $1 million in reserves, you can write loans up to a ceiling, to a limit. Let's just say it's $10 million. Okay, that's fractional lending. So a fraction of your reserves is collateralizing, is supporting a loan, is supporting, so $1 million supports $10 million in loans. Okay, very simple explanation. Well, those reserves right now in the private banking sector are actually higher than the minimum required, because the banks have been hoarding cash. They have not wanted to buy bonds. And this is contrary to the design that the Fed has put out, the Treasury has put out. This is contrary. They don't want private bankers hoarding cash. They want them to buy the debt instruments. They want them to get into the bond market. So in the short term, the yield, the inverted yield curve, they say, hey, we'll raise the interest rates on the bonds, the debt instruments, for short-term bonds. If you'll just come out and buy them, take some of your excess reserve cash, get it out of there, and get into the debt market. We need to prop it up. We need to keep it going, at least till November. And that's what the banks have been doing. So you have this inverted yield curve. That's why I said that's the chink in the armor. That's the window in to see. That's putting the thermometer under the tongue of the patient to see what's really going on. Okay? I can appreciate that a lot of this sounds very dry and sounds like, wow, I haven't got 2 nickels to rub together. Well, neither do I. Okay? I don't buy stocks. I don't buy bonds. I don't buy precious metals. I don't have the money to invest. And I'm sure many of you listening to this, I understand to a relatively, I don't know what level, just a basic understanding of the economy, enough to present some of this to you and to write about it to, in the magazine. And certainly I'm not a financial advisor. But I understand it to a reasonable degree. I don't have to be an investor to know how the game plays. I don't have to go into the casino and put my money on red or on black of the roulette wheel. I don't need to. But I understand that the house always wins and the game is rigged, and that's why I don't even go into a casino, even if I had the money to play, even if I had the money to invest. I don't, because it's a losing proposition. Completely rigged, completely manipulated. And it's the poor Joe Bag of Donuts that gets sucked in to putting their money into the markets that is the ultimate loser. The unfortunate thing is that you and I that don't invest in the markets and do understand how the economy operates and how the stock market operates, we understand it. We choose not to participate in it, but we too will suffer because the global economies are set to collapse. And the blame, as I've been saying several times, will be focused upon COVID-19, and this is why it was brought out. It was brought out to crash the economies. Because the economies were already crashing, the powers that be, the one percenters, did not want the public to start blaming them, and they were on the verge, the tipping point. In September of last year, the tipping point had been reached to start placing the blame where blame was due to be placed. And they didn't want to be blamed. So they timed the coronavirus to come out at that tipping point of blame, to divert the attention of the world. So we can examine the biology, we can look at the virology, we can look at the RO numbers, we can look at the spread, we can look at all those things. But understand, it's an economic contagion. It is not a viral contagion. It's an economic contagion that was pre-existing, a pre-existing medical condition in the economy of the world. Okay, I'll check my notes one more time. Again, I always have more prepared than I am able to find time to present to you. So I have to check to make sure I'm not missing something absolutely imperative. Bretton Woods. Let's talk about Bretton Woods. 1971 gold standard. Most of you have heard of this. Maybe you'd like to hear a little bit of detail. But this is what started us on this slippery slope we're dealing with right now. This is where the can started getting kicked down the road in earnest. The Bretton Woods system of monetary management established the rules for commercial and financial relations among the United States, Canada, Western European countries, Australia, and Japan after the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement. The Bretton Woods system was the first example of a fully negotiated monetary order intended to govern monetary relations among independent states. That means nation states. The chief features of the Bretton Woods system were an obligation for each country to adopt a monetary policy that maintained its external exchange rates within 1% by tying its currency to gold, and the ability of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, to bridge temporary imbalances of payments. Also, there was a need to address the lack of cooperation among other countries and to prevent competitive devaluation of the currencies as well. So, unpacking this, it means that they were going to say that the currencies would all have within 1% an agreed upon value. They would set the value of participating countries' currencies, sovereign currencies, to the value of gold. It was pegged to the value of gold, pegged to the gold market. So as gold would go up and down in valuations, this basket of currencies that were tied to gold would move up and down in their valuation. And the International Monetary Fund was there to act as what became the International Bank of Settlements. Okay? So they were trying to keep the balance of payments under control through the IMF, and that still happens today. Okay? Preparing to rebuild the international economic system while World War II was still raging, 730 delegates from all 44 Allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, United States, for the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, also known as the Bretton Woods Conference. The delegates deliberated during July 1st to the 22nd in 1944 and signed the agreement on its final day, setting up a system of rules, institutions, and procedures to regulate the international monetary system. Okay? Now I'm going to skip down. On 15 August 1971, the United States unilaterally terminated convertibility of the US dollar to gold, effectively bringing the Bretton Woods system to an end and rendering the dollar a fiat currency. At the same time, many fixed currencies, such as the pound sterling, also became free-floating. That's where this mess really got its start. President Nixon was in office. He's the one that's often been blamed, because he's the figurehead, blamed for taking us off the gold standard. So our dollar had never been tied to the value of gold in the market. And even today, it's not tied to the value of gold in the market because, as I described earlier, we have the dollar tripling in value while gold is going up, which doesn't happen. But this shows you the disconnect of the dollar to gold, but the disconnect of the rest of the sovereign nations' currencies from the gold standard, and the disconnect of those currencies and their economies from the U.S. stock market. Remember I said the U.S. stock market in 2008 separated from the economic conditions of the global economic system, and the market went off on its own and did its own thing, propped up by the actions of the U.S. Central Bank, known as the Federal Reserve. My tangent to that I'm really trying to restrict myself from going down until tomorrow is a discussion about the Bank of London, as I said earlier. They're the ones that really determine the U.S. Central Bank's actions. It happens over there in England. It doesn't happen in Washington, D.C. Okay? You might think we're still a colony of Great Britain, of England, I should say, in particular. And to a financial extent, we are. The other tangent that I would like to talk about tomorrow, connected to that, is the Cayman Islands. Because most of the world's wealth, to whatever degree that you want to describe wealth and tie it to, most of the world's wealth is tied up in blind trusts, secret trusts. Forget about Switzerland. Swiss banking pales in comparison to what's going on in the Cayman Islands, which is a colony of England. And the Cayman Island banking system, financial system, was set up through the London Bank. And when you hear about tax havens and offshore accounts and corporations not paying their taxes and wealthy people sheltering their money, and not just money and gold, but objects of wealth, racehorses, art, are put into secret trusts in the Cayman Islands. That's where the bulk of the one percenters' wealth is tied up, in secret trusts that then have all of these blind corporations set up that are shell corporations that hold all of these various instruments of wealth, hard assets of wealth. Okay? So we'll talk about the Cayman Islands tomorrow. But understand that this shell game is all by design. And it's designed to collapse, but to be collapsed without the blame being assigned, and therefore the accountability assigned by the peasants, us, you and me, the middle class, if you will, the peasants uprising against the one percenters. They didn't want that to happen, so they had to find a way to place blame somewhere else, and they did it through COVID-19. Now, I've got pages of notes here that I haven't even referenced tonight, so I'll get into these notes tomorrow. They're numbers and specifics and all of that. I just gave you the overview tonight. I hope it wasn't too dry. I hope it wasn't too fear-mongering. I hope it wasn't discouraging. Please don't be discouraged by this, because it is God's plan that all of this take place. I think his plan is the 180 of COVID-19 pandemic, the 180 of that, and I said this on Sunday and even last week, the 180 of all this fear-mongering, whether it's COVID or the fear regarding the economy, is to flip it around and say, hey, this shows those that want to hear, those that want to see the nearness of the return of Jesus Christ. And therefore, all of this stuff that the world wants to pump out as fear-mongering, we flip the fear around and say, Jesus Christ is the solution to all this. So get right with God. Get right in forming a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Get saved, dude. Because here it is. Here's all the evidence. Watchman on the wall. Here's all the evidence. This is the hordes coming. Okay? The barbarians are at the gate. So it is time. It is time. It is definitely time to get right with God. Just 180 all this nonsense. Okay? If you have questions, email them to me, please. And I'll take time tomorrow to answer them. Or make note of your questions and hold them over tomorrow. And remind me in chat tomorrow when we start the chat room. When we start the live stream tomorrow, that I'll take your questions at the beginning of Thursday's live stream. Okay? I'm sure you have a lot of questions. I'm sure you have a lot of comments. But we've been here for 2 hours. I appreciate your patience in allowing me to really sort of present my case in its entirety as just an overview. Okay? So God bless you all. Lord willing, we'll get back together tomorrow evening. And thank you very much. Good night.